The word printed across the top of the page was denied, and Karen read it 3 times in the hospital hallway before it stopped sounding like a clerical mistake. Her father, Walter, was resting 2 doors down, still too weak to stand without help after the fall that had landed him in this building. And his Medicare Advantage plan had just decided he did not need the short-term skilled nursing rehab his hospital team had formally requested. She had braced herself for a bill someday, somewhere down the road, but she had never once braced herself for a flat refusal. Standing under the flat white hallway light, holding a printed notice from the same plan the family had trusted for years, Karen felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her, because a single word had turned a medical question into a fight she had no idea how to begin. Here is the part almost no one explains to a frightened daughter standing in that exact hallway. In a federal review of Medicare Advantage prior authorization, among the skilled nursing denials that families actually chose to appeal, 95% were overturned in favor of the enrollee. So why do so many families take that one hard word as the final page of the story and quietly close the book? A first refusal from an insurance plan can feel like a verdict handed down, closed and final and heavy, especially when your father is lying in a bed a few feet away and the clock inside your own chest has already started running. Yet a denial is a decision, and a decision made by people can be reviewed by people. The real danger in that hallway is not the printed letter at all. The danger is the understandable, exhausted urge to accept the letter, to carry a fragile parent home long before he is ready, simply because the plan said no and nobody ever told you that no could be a door instead of a wall. Karen did not understand any of that yet, standing there in her coat. She only understood that her father's own therapist had used the word unsafe, that the plan had used the word denied, and that those 2 careful words could not both be true at the same time. What she chose to do in the quiet days after that hallway is the entire difference this video was built to show you, and it is not a trick, and it is not a loophole, and it is not a secret code. It is the simple, human difference between a family that opens the envelope and a family that lets it sit in a drawer. There is a version of that week where Karen never turns the letter over, and it is worth watching closely, because she came within 2 days of living inside it. In that version she keeps dialing numbers, prices out private aids, signs the discharge forms, and drives Walter home to the same house with the same porch step that already beat him once. She sets the plan's letter on the hall table, face down, next to his reading glasses, and never once reads past the word stamped on top. Walter is home, and the family tells itself he is doing fine, and the word denied slowly hardens into a fact that nobody in the house questions again. That version of Karen is not lazy, and she is not foolish. She is simply what fear makes of a good daughter with a short calendar and a weak father resting down the hall. But there is a second version of that very same week, and in it Walter earns his supervised weeks of therapy, comes home steadier on his own feet, and the letter becomes a story the family tells later instead of a wound they quietly carry for years. The only thing standing between those 2 versions of Walter is whether anyone in that house questions the plan's decision at all before surrendering to the word stamped on the front. That is the entire hinge of his recovery, and it is almost unbearably small. It takes no lawyer, no courtroom, and no clever move that Karen secretly had in her, because she had run out of clever days ago, somewhere around the 2nd sleepless night. It comes down to one exhausted family choosing, on one hard evening, to ask a single question instead of trusting the headline. Hold both versions of that week in your mind as this goes on, because someday your own family may stand in that same kitchen, holding that same envelope, only days away from an ending you will have to live inside for years. To understand what Karen was truly facing that afternoon, you have to picture Walter one ordinary week earlier, before any letter existed. He was 79 years old, still living in the same small house he had painted himself decades ago, still walking out to the mailbox every single morning. Right up until the morning his knee buckled on the porch step and an ordinary day dissolved into an ambulance ride. The hospital did exactly what good hospitals do. They stabilized him, they treated the immediate injury, and then, far sooner than the family expected, the staff began gently using the word discharge. But Walter still could not stand on his own, still could not safely cross a room without a hand to steady him, and every single person in that room understood that sending him straight home would be sending him directly toward the next hard fall. This is the precise moment that short-term skilled nursing rehab exists to handle. After a qualifying hospital stay, a Medicare Advantage plan may cover short-term skilled nursing care, the kind where nurses and physical therapists patiently help a weakened body relearn how to walk, how to stand, and how to be safe again inside its own home. That care is not the same thing as long-term custodial nursing home living, where a person stays permanently because they can no longer manage daily life alone. Families blur those two ideas constantly, and the difference genuinely matters, because the plan was never being asked to move Walter into a facility for the rest of his natural life. The plan was only being asked to grant him a few supervised weeks of therapy so that he could return home and actually remain there. Walter's hospital team requested exactly that, in writing, through the plan's prior authorization process, the approval step a private plan can require before it agrees to cover certain kinds of care. And the plan, after its internal review of that request, sent back the answer no. Here is the part that is almost impossible to see clearly from a fluorescent hallway, the part that makes an honest daughter feel as though she is losing her mind. Karen had personally watched her father fail a slow, shaky walk down the corridor with her own two eyes. She knew, beyond any doubt, that he was not safe. So how could a plan look at the very same man and rule that he did not need skilled care? The quiet answer is that the plan was never actually looking at the same man. The plan was not standing in that room. A prior authorization decision is made by reviewers reading a file, weighing the clinical notes, the codes, and the documentation a provider submits against the plan's own internal criteria for what officially counts as medically necessary skilled care. If the paperwork that finally reaches the plan is thin, or one important phrase is missing, or the clinical picture on the page reads milder than the frightened man actually breathing in the bed, the answer can come back as a denial that has almost nothing to do with how unsafe Walter truly remained that afternoon. That invisible gap is the thing almost nobody warns a family about. There is the living reality inside the hospital room, and there is the paper record that travels onward to the plan, and those two versions of the very same person are not always the same size. A tired family naturally sees the full, breathing reality in front of them and simply assumes the plan reviewers must have seen it too. Very often, though, those reviewers only ever saw the flat file on the screen. A missing therapy note, a vague summary, a box left unchecked by an overworked staffer racing through a dozen discharges. Any one of these small paper gaps can quietly shrink a genuinely fragile man down into a case that looks routine. None of that changes the truth of who is lying in the bed. It only changes the story the plan was handed. Which means a denial is frequently a statement about incomplete documentation rather than a final verdict on a human being. And that single shift in understanding is the exact thing that turns a solid wall back into an ordinary door. The mistake that almost cost Walter his recovery was the gentlest one imaginable. It was his own daughter seeing the word denied and believing it was the closed end of the sentence. That belief only began to crack the evening Karen finally made herself look up what the plan's own review process had actually found, and the numbers she came across stopped her cold. In a federal review, Medicare Advantage plans denied about 12% of prior authorization requests for skilled nursing facility admission. Only about 18% of those denials were ever appealed. And among the denials that families did appeal, 95% were overturned in favor of the enrollee. Karen read those three numbers twice, and a small sick feeling moved through her, because she saw exactly how close she had come to being one of the many who never appealed at all. She was careful with what the numbers meant. Not every denial is wrong, and appealing guarantees nothing, and no one could promise her that Walter would be approved on a second look. But the plan's own reviewers had reversed the great majority of the denials that families actually bothered to question. The number that stayed with her that night was not the 95. It was the 18, because it meant most families who were told no had simply stopped there, the way she nearly had, and their parents had gone home without the therapy, and no one ever learned which of those quiet refusals would have been overturned. Karen sat very still with that thought, the therapy notes in one hand and the denial in the other. She had been 2 days and one unopened envelope away from becoming a number nobody would ever count. The thing that saved her was not that she suddenly grew brave or clever. It was only that somebody finally read the plan its own words back, slowly, at the kitchen table, until the word denied stopped sounding like the end of Walter's story. The cost of that first version of the week would not have waited politely for anyone in that house. Picture Walter home too soon, on the same slick bathroom tile, one careful step away from the fall that finishes what the porch step started, and a second fall in a man his age is rarely a gentle repeat of the first one. Picture Karen sleeping upright in the chair beside his bed, awake at every creak of the floor, becoming a round-the-clock nurse she was never trained to be, until her own health quietly begins to fray at the edges. The family starts buying grab bars and a shower chair in a scramble, quietly paying out of pocket for private aids far earlier than they ever needed to, making rushed and expensive choices with money that never had to leave the account that fast. And running underneath all of it sits something quieter and much heavier, the slow guilt of a child who suspects, somewhere in the back of her tired mind, that there had been a notice worth reading and a decision worth questioning, and that she had simply been too overwhelmed and too afraid to look. That is the real weight of a denial accepted too quickly. It is not merely the lost weeks of therapy on a schedule. It is the preventable second fall on the bathroom tile, the daughter who doses off standing up, the credit card carrying private aids it was never meant to carry, and the long private shadow of a child wondering, years later, whether a few supervised weeks of skilled care might have changed the entire shape of her father's final chapter. And none of that cost would have shown up anywhere on the plan's letter. The letter only ever mentioned the therapy it would not cover. Everything else, the second fall and the sleepless months and the money and the slow guilt, Walter and Karen would have paid quietly, at home, in the dark, long after everyone else had stopped talking about a single piece of paper. Karen very nearly became that exact story herself. For 2 long days the denial letter lay face down and untouched on the kitchen table while she made frantic phone calls and priced out private aids, and Walter's discharge date crept steadily closer like a rising tide. It was her own daughter, home from college and standing at the counter, who finally reached over, turned that letter face up, and began reading it aloud at the table, and the whole room went very still. Because the notice did not only say no to the family. It also explained, in the plain and patient language they had skipped past in their panic, exactly how a member can ask the plan to look at the decision again, and by roughly when. Karen quietly sat down. She stopped dialing numbers. She pulled out 3 separate pieces of paper and laid them side by side under the warm kitchen light, the hospital's own discharge information, the plan's printed denial, and her father's detailed therapy notes describing precisely how unsafe he still was. Her daughter pointed quietly at one line in the therapy notes, then at one line in the denial, and the two lines plainly did not describe the same man. Nobody in the kitchen raised a voice. The tea went cold on the counter while the three of them simply looked. Looking at those three papers resting together, Karen finally saw the thing that raw fear had hidden from her for 2 full days. She was not begging anyone for a personal favor. She was calmly pointing out that the paper record the plan had leaned on did not match the living man her own eyes had watched fail a walk down a hospital hall. The panic did not magically vanish from her chest, but it changed its shape entirely. It became a clear question she could actually ask, backed by real paper she actually held, and for the first time since that awful hallway, Karen was not carrying the whole weight alone or in the dark. The denial letter went back onto the kitchen table that night, but this time it lay face up, fully unfolded, and unfolded all the way to the very last line. Nothing about Walter's larger situation was magically solved. He was still weak, the appeal was still only beginning, and no one sitting in that kitchen could honestly promise how the plan would rule the second time around. But the family had finally stopped letting one printed word make a permanent decision on their behalf. Maybe a letter like that will land on your own table someday, with a parent resting down the hall and the word denied staring straight up at you. If it does, the gentlest thing in the world is also the thing Karen very nearly skipped, which is only to pause, turn the paper over, and read it to the end before you decide to believe it. A first no is a decision, and a decision can be reviewed, and the quiet door is usually hiding right there on the page nobody wanted to open. It may not become the answer you were praying for, and it will not always end the way a family quietly hopes. Yet so many households never even find out what was truly possible, only because the envelope stayed sealed inside a kitchen drawer. Reading it changes nothing about how much you love the person down the hall. It only changes whether that love ever gets its fair chance to be heard. Walter's envelope did not stay sealed. His granddaughter turned it over, his daughter went through it to the very end, and together they turned a solid wall back into an ordinary door, and whatever the plan decided next, this family faced it awake, side by side, and no longer afraid of a single word. The first denial is very rarely the final page of anyone's story. Sometimes it is only the quiet page where a tired, frightened family finally sits close together and, at long last,